Good evening and welcome to Fairfax Presbyterian Church. I'm Henry Brinton, the pastor here, and I am so glad to see all of you here for this very important book talk and conversation that we're going to hear tonight. This church is a house of prayer for all peoples, as you can see from the Isaiah passage on our wall, and so I hope that you all feel very much at home in this place. Just a few housekeeping items before we get into the introductions of our speakers. First of all, this book talk is being live streamed, so there is a chance you'll be on camera. I hope that's not a problem for anybody, but you can then watch this on YouTube at the Fairfax Presbyterian Church channel after today and maybe share it with friends. So it's nice we'll have that recording. Out in the narthex, we have Barnes & Noble selling copies of the Mother Emanuel book. You can purchase a copy if you've not already done so, and our author, Kevin Sack, is here to sign and inscribe those books after the talk tonight. There are bathrooms at the other end of the narthex, up one level and then down another level. So if you need to use the facilities, please feel free to at any time. And we have ice water in the narthex. You can help yourself to that if you need some refreshment. So this is going to be a great night, an important night. This is a book that we need to engage, and I'm so very happy that the author, Kevin Sack, is here to speak and to have conversation with the Reverend William Lamar. I'm so glad you're here also. I want to introduce the Reverend John Molina Moore, the executive presbyter of National Capital Presbytery, who is going to do the formal introductions tonight. The AME Church has bishops. We Presbyterians do not have bishops, but if we did, it would be John. Before I turn the mic over to him, though, I just want to thank you, Kevin, for the way that you have portrayed the Mother Emanuel Church in your book. It's clear to me that you really get the church. You understand its peril, its promise, its possibility, and that is so important to many of us in this room who are active in our churches in this area. So thank you for that. And now, John.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, folks. It's so good to see you. I'm assuming there's some folks from Metropolitan here, correct? Right? We have some other, yes, Metropolitan AME. We have some other Presbyterians that are non-Fairfax Presbyterians in the room also. So it is wonderful to see all of these places collide. Why I'm excited for what we're going to do tonight goes beyond hearing from a wonderful author and a writer, but in conversation with a pastor serving also a very historic and prominent AME church here. Well, we're not in Washington, D.C., but here in the DMV of Metropolitan AME, which is downtown off 16th Street. Many of you know that church. So this tonight will be what I hope the work of this book is how do we continue to be in conversation about this. So I invite our two folks to come on up. That's Kevin Sack, our author tonight, and Reverend Doctor, right? Just Reverend. Just Bill. Bill Lamar, the pastor at AME Metropolitan in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, please take the stage.
Good evening, everyone. And again, I want to thank Kevin and this staff for the invitation and thank Fairfax for your hospitality. Before we go any further, I want us to take a moment to remember that these were human beings and they had names and they had stories, and I want to call their names. I knew many of them, had conversations, traveled with them, and the pain is still uniquely felt. Clemente Pinckney, Cynthia Graham Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lee Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tywanza Sanders, Daniel L. Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson were those who perished, and there were also survivors. Now, Kevin, I want to thank you for this work, this labor, for what you have given birth to, for the pain. And I have some names that I'd like to call tonight that I want to use to kind of bookend our conversation. But the first name, and it's important for me just to hear how you respond to hearing the name of Martin Sack Jr. What would you say about him?
Oh my gosh, you can make me cry. That's my dad, and he passed away several years before this happened. So he was not here either for the event or for to see the work and the result of the work. But my mother and I have been talking a lot lately about how great it would be to have him here to enjoy the moment with us, and how proud he would be of the work. I mentioned in the book that in the acknowledgments of the book that if the reader finds the prose even slightly breezy, it is a tribute to his legacy, because that was his favorite description of when he would assess my work. If he concluded that a particular article had been breezy, meaning he had been able to get through it, it was really it's really what he was saying, Pastor. I had done my job, so he is very much missed at this time.
Thank you for sharing that. And I did underline that you say that breezy was his highest compliment.
Yes, that was the compliment.
And having not known him, but having read this work and living with an author, I understand that work like this is produced through many dangers, toils, and snares, and with the love and support of family. Your wife is here. You talk about your family. So we want to thank you and the community that surrounded you that helped to give birth to this work. Thank you all.
Absolutely.
So as we were discussing my thoughts in the back, I said that I feel like you have braided together 3 genres. This book is at least a third novel, because it reads in that way. It unfolds with beautiful writing and description, which is steeped in extraordinary research and scores of interviews. So it's at least a third novel. It's at least a third history. I knew some of these persons historically, Richard Allen, Morris Brown, so many others, but texture that you added was very helpful. And it is at least a third journalism. I think your journalistic skill shines through, because you attack very difficult things about the church, about the AME church, about American religion writ large, about American violence politically, theologically, and in other ways that many would take umbrage with, but you go forward with the truth. What gave you what was necessary to braid these things, and to be honest enough to put on the page some things that many of us whisper about but dare not say beyond the confines of kitchen and shower in our own minds?
Yeah. I guess I really attribute that to my journalistic background. I'm now 65 years old. I've been at this for a while. And I've done a lot of work that led me to this book. In fact, I very much feel that that I was meant to write this book, and that I also could not have written it at any other point in my life or career. That everything that came before it prepared me for this. I had spent an uncommon amount of time, I guess, in and around black churches as part of my career.
So have I.
Yeah, and I've heard. But starting with, I'll tell a real quick story just because it's sort of entertaining. The first time I ever stepped foot into a black church, I was an intern at the Atlanta Constitution, and I'm 20 years old, the summer after my junior year in college. And one of my fellow interns was a woman named Brenda Russell. She was from Alabama, African-American woman, went to Harvard, incredibly bright, and we became friends. And one day she says, you really ought to go to church with me this Sunday. I said, okay. And she said, yeah, my Uncle Ralph is preaching. You'll enjoy it. I said, all right. So I meet her at Wheat Street Baptist Church in Atlanta on a Sunday morning. And Uncle Ralph ends up being Ralph David Abernathy. And I'm the only white person in the church. And at the beginning of the service, he has all the visitors stand up to be recognized. And I was recognized. And we all sat down, and then he points at me. You, back up. And he has me stand up for what felt like 4 days to me, but was probably 2 or 3 minutes, and he interrogates me. Who are you, and why are you here, and what are you doing at the Constitution this summer, and how do you know my niece, and where do you go to school? And it was incredibly uncomfortable, but after I sat down and started thinking about it, I started thinking, what was that about? And I decided that he wanted me to feel, I don't know. My sense of it was that he wanted me to feel my otherness in this setting and to understand what it felt like to be an African American in a white world every day. And I had some, that discomfort was there, and it sticks with me to this day. Long way of getting back to the point of saying I did spend a lot of time in black churches over the course of my journalistic career in Atlanta. I was there at a time when the governance of the city was transitioning from white to black, and I spent my days hanging out with Reverend Andrew Young and Reverend Joseph Lowry and Maynard Jackson and John Lewis and Julian Bond, and a lot of the city's politics took place in black churches. So I do feel like I was something of a student of the black church from the get-go. I was always intrigued and fascinated by it. And so when this happened, I think all of my journalistic instincts and experience did kick into gear.
You said, and I think it's important for those here and those online to hear this, looking at this, I was like, this took a very long time. And you said that you began this essentially the night the tragedy occurred.
Yeah.
Could you just say a little bit about what gripped you and called you to this work immediately?
Dina and I were home that night in Atlanta. I had CNN on. I was reading the newspaper when the first reports came over, and when the newscaster said that it was an African Methodist Episcopal church, my heart just kind of sank. Even before there was any disclosure of who the perpetrator was and what his intent was, I just had a feeling that this was going to wind up being the hate crime that it wound up being. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I didn't know anything about Emanuel. I'd never heard of the place. I started Googling the church that night, and up popped stories with just the basic outlines of the church's history, and I just got fascinated by everything that had happened at this place before that night. And it was clear that this event was going to be a major occurrence in our racial history. I felt a couple of things. I felt that that it mattered ultimately that the killer had chosen this place as his target, and that people should understand why it mattered, and also that the church shouldn't be forever known for what happened that night, or shouldn't be forever known only for what happened that night, that people should understand the broader story of the place, and therefore be able to put it into this event into context. The other thing I started feeling a couple of days later, after the first bond hearing for the killer, at which all of you will remember 5 of the family members of the victims got up one after the next, trooped to a microphone. They had no understanding before they got there that they were going to be afforded an opportunity to speak, but one after the next, they all expressed some form of forgiveness towards this utterly remorseless white supremacist killer who less than 48 hours earlier had destroyed their lives and their community. That I found both awe-inspiring and befuddling, and wanted to know how that had possibly come to happen, and decided that the answer to that question might lie somewhere within the history of that congregation and of the denomination. And that's really what set me off on the exploration.
Scholars like I, Sertima, and others have contended that seafaring African people actually came to these shores even prior to Columbus. But this book contends, with great research, that this story begins in 1526 and not in 2015, when the first West Africans came to South Carolina. And part of the tension, I don't know that you could ever understand South Carolina politics today without understanding this, is the fact that beginning in 1820, there were more persons of African descent than white people in South Carolina, and that Charleston, according to what you say here, was, I think, the 4th largest city in the United States and among the wealthiest, right, because of the labor that was extracted. Very much, and I know you read this gentleman because you cite him, as Richard Newman says, you can't tell the story of the AME Church without Philadelphia. This is a uniquely Charleston story. Mm-hmm. Tell us how Charleston sets the stage for what unfolds.
Well, what happens, I'll start in Philadelphia real quickly. What happens in Philadelphia is the creation of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination around 1816, after a decades-long gestation, led by a man named Richard Allen, who is recognized by Richard Newman and others as sort of our least appreciated founding father. Remarkable man who was able to buy his way out of enslavement and became a lay preacher. And there's a signal incident in which at the mainline Methodist Church, white-controlled Methodist Church in Philadelphia, black congregants are literally lifted off of their knees while in prayer and told to go up to the gallery to a different seating area. And this leads Allen to walk out of the church with all of the black members and eventually to form his own congregation and his own denomination. There were echoes of this in Charleston only a year or two later, when almost exactly the same thing happens. The dynamics were different because, as you mentioned, in Charleston was a majority black town at this point, and the Methodist churches were heavily majority black, controlled by whites, owned and governed by whites. But most of the congregants were enslaved African Americans and free people of color as well. There are a series of offenses over time in the white Methodist churches in Charleston in which some of the autonomy that black congregants had to, say, collect their own funds and distribute their own funds for charitable purposes were eroded And the straw that breaks the camel's back is when the white leaders of the congregation decide to build a garage for their horse-drawn hearse on top of a black burial ground. And it's always burial ground issues, right? I mean, it's these things crop up constantly in racial church conflicts. Morris Brown leads a mass walkout of thousands of African American congregants from those churches, and immediately they buy a piece of land on Charleston Neck and start to build a physical church. There are reports in the dispatches of white Methodist ministers in Charleston despairing over their absence, that their absence can be felt, especially in the lack of singing, they say. So it was immediately noticeable and of significant concern to the white leaders of those churches.
So before they become an official part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, there is a chapter about the African church in Charleston. And the African church is considered a dangerous place. There are laws in South Carolina that keep black people from gathering without the presence of whites to superintend the work. And when the Vesey plot unfolds, and I think that your history corrects a lot of what I have told myself about what happened and what actually did not happen. But that those who saw the African church, a place of black theological and ecclesial intellectual freedom, as fundamentally dangerous to their power and to the American project. Can you say more about that? Because I think there's some people that might still feel that way.
Yeah, no, they saw it instantly saw it as a real threat. And almost immediately after the physical church, the African church, was constructed, there were raids on the church, there were mass arrests, and it all, yes, comes very much to a head in 1822. How many folks have heard of Denmark Vesey? Okay, pretty good. Denmark Vesey is a central figure in the history of this church and in the history of Charleston. He was an enslaved man who was able to buy his way out of freedom in 1800 by, of all things, hitting the lottery. Bought a lottery ticket, won. I think it was $1,500, something like that. Negotiated his purchase price with his owner, and became a free man, a rather skilled carpenter who was able to. He was a man of some means, and in 1822, the authorities uncover a vast insurrection plot that they attribute to him. They accuse him of being the leader of the plot. There are scores of African Americans arrested. There are trials, and as a result, 35 men are hung, including Vesey. Vesey was among the first to go to the gallows. And what was so interesting to me as I dug into the trial record, and there's this remarkable record to this trial, which makes it a really valuable sort of historical document to be interpreted. When I look at the numbers in the documents, you almost get the sense that it was really the church itself that was on trial. And this, of course, feeds off of this fear of the African church from its inception. The statistical analysis showed that members of the African church were twice as likely to be arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death as those who were not members. And when you look at the trial record, witnesses and suspects were asked repeatedly, are you a member of the African church? Is he a member of the African church? So this seemed to be really what they were after. And in the aftermath of those trials, after the hangings, the church is literally dismantled board by board under order of the authorities. And the leaders of the church, including Morris Brown, are forced into exile. They go to Philadelphia, where Morris Brown becomes the second bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination.
One of the things I want to thank you for is for giving humanity to the enslaved Africans. So the story you tell about Vesey, would you pronounce Telemach or Telemach?
Telemachus.
Telemachus, which is in the Greek myth, but they dubbed him that, and Denmark is, as you say, a corruption of that name. Right. But it talks about how during your work talks about during the voyage, those who controlled the slave ship were taken with his beauty, alertness, and intelligence. And that he found a way, I love this, that it seemed anytime he was ordered into the fields, he would be felled by epileptic seizures, a condition some historians attribute to clever malingering and not misfiring neurons. So the power that he took, but also I've often, America's myths are galling to me at many points. But to lift up Washington as a hero and Jefferson as a hero, but not Vesey, is very problematic. Mm-hmm. Listen to Rolla Bennett, who delivers a lecture on America's founding contradiction. This is during the trial and the records that Kevin so ably adapts in the book. Sin. What sin? The imprisoned man asked. You applaud the leaders of the American Revolution who resisted a small tax on tea and rather than pay it killed tens of thousands. But what was that tax to our sufferings? Washington was a white man and you idolized him, but I, alas, am a black man and you hang me for the very act you applauded in him.
Pretty amazing for that place and time, right?
I was like, this is my hero.
Yeah. Interestingly, he was his enslaver was the governor of the state.
Wow. There is, after this insurrection, and the book unfolds historically, there is a huge crackdown. And one of the things you write about, and others have written about as well, that what happened in Haiti seized the American imagination and frightened enslavers in America. They tried to keep that news from circulating. Because one of the things you also share from the Stono Rebellion, that Africans have always rebelled, have always pushed back. And it was interesting that the crackdown after the Vesey situation, that it yields to others being able to reestablish the African church through the African Methodist Episcopal Church after the crackdown of the Vesey insurrection. How were they skillfully able to give birth again to a building they had to take down board by board? Yeah. Just weave a little bit of that story.
Well, it didn't happen until after the Civil War. Between the 1822, when the Vesey Rebellion took place, or didn't take place, and the discovery took place, and the church is destroyed, and 1865, there really is no record of the church's existence or of the congregation remaining in place in any kind. I think we can safely assume that it existed underground in some fashion, probably in small groups, maybe, occasional gatherings and parlors and hush harbors and things like that. But nonetheless, the remembrance, I think, of the power and the force of African Methodism and the role that it played in those few years in the late 18-teens and early 1820s remains strong in the in the community. And so it's really interesting when well before the end of the Civil War, I think it's around 1861, 1862, some of you may be familiar with the Port Royal area in South Carolina, and Civil War historians will know that it was occupied by Union troops early on in the war. There's something called the Port Royal Experiment, which was sort of an early version of Reconstruction that was tried in this area. And this is south of Charleston, near the Hilton Head area. And AME missionaries are recruited at that point to go into that area to serve the spiritual needs of the now thousands and thousands of emancipated former slaves who are now under the control of the Union troops and the federal government. Those same missionaries wind up following Union forces into Charleston immediately after they take the city in the spring of 1865, and others are sent down from the north, and they quickly begin to form a new congregation that is called Emanuel at that point. And there was competition both from the Northern Methodists. I mean, there was sort of this land rush for, the souls of the emancipated. There was just this huge body of people waiting to be collected, right, along with their tithes, needless to say. And the African Methodists, because of the loyalty that had been established 40-odd years earlier, took the lead and very quickly became the largest Protestant denomination in all of Charleston. They purchased a piece of land. Interestingly enough, the seller of that piece of land was the then imprisoned Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederate States of America, who has been arrested after the end of the war. He's in jail in Georgia. Tremendously wealthy man with commercial interests in shipping and banking and cotton, big slaveholder. His financial empire is crumbling. He's facing bankruptcy. He needs to generate cash, and he has an agent sell this piece of property at 110 Calhoun Street to a group of trustees who then go and form the first autonomous African-American religious congregation in the South. Quite a reversal of fortunes. Yeah.
There are so many fascinating historical facts. One is, tell us how Abraham Lincoln's life might have been different had he been in Charleston and not sent his personal secretary and had not gone to Ford's Theater.
Yeah, it was that night when they reoccupied, when the war ended, and there was a huge celebration at Fort Sumter to commemorate the moment the flag that had been taken down from Sumter was raised once again, the flag that was taken down when Sumter was surrendered to Confederate troops was raised once again. Robert Smalls, anyone know who Robert Smalls was? Robert Smalls was just a remarkable hero of the Civil War, an enslaved man who managed to commandeer a Union ship, a Confederate ship, the Planter, and pick up his family members and sail it out of Charleston Harbor and deliver it into the hands of Union troops. He sails up to Fort Sumter in the Planter with the decks teeming with people as part of the celebration. Anyway, Lincoln did not come. He sent his personal secretary, and that night he's assassinated at Ford's Theater.
You mentioned Daniel Alexander Payne, and there's some African Methodists here, some from Metropolitan, some colleagues. Good to see you tonight. Metropolitan would not exist without Daniel Payne, and a lot of the work that was done in South Carolina revolves around his ascetic and acerbic, there are other words, but a fascinating human being. Say a little bit about Daniel Alexander Payne.
So Payne was a native Charlestonian and a scholar, a teacher, and created a school for free persons of color in Charleston back in the late 1820s, early 1830s, I guess it was. very flamboyant character. He used to teach in a pink robe. And one of my favorite story about him was he was fascinated with biology.
That's my favorite one too. Yeah.
Yeah, and at one point he brings a live alligator into the classroom and instructs a student to shoot it, and then carves it up while the animal is still moving, basically, in the classroom. And he writes about this and how proud he is of the way that he instructs this class.
He also cooks the meat.
Yeah, and he also made a habit of eating all of the animals that he killed and dissected, with the exception of frogs, which he said he just couldn't tolerate. So, anyway, in 1834, as a result of in response largely to the Vesey insurrection, among the statutes that are passed by the General Assembly in South Carolina is one that ends the ability it ends the education of free people of color. He has to close his school and leaves for the North, where he joins the AME denomination, becomes a minister, and then returns south in a very emotional moment in 1865, 30 years later, at the end of the war, and helps revive African Methodism in South Carolina and helps to start Emanuel. And yes, he was a bit of a prig, right? He was known for his distaste for sort of outlandish shows of religious fervor. He didn't like ring shouts. He didn't like dancing. He didn't like the loud music. And so there was something of a conflict between his wing of African Methodism and some of the older line, old school, less educated pastors who were more moved by the Spirit, let's say.
Our church historian, Junior, is here. Eugenia Jacobs, her mother, Thelma Jacobs, is our historian. One of the stories, I didn't know that Daniel Payne shot alligators, dissected them, and did that stuff. And I also, Kevin relays a story that a gentleman comes, and also it's important to note that Daniel Payne and Abraham Lincoln were close confidants, and he would walk to the White House, knock on the door, sit in front of the fire with Lincoln, help to encourage Lincoln to emancipate the enslaved here. Right. But someone visited Payne's house, took off their fedora, tossed it in the chair. Payne went and sat on the fedora, held court with the person until he was finished talking, and on that person's way out, Payne stood up, gave him the hat and money to replace it, and said, hats belong on racks and not in chairs.
Right.
And so I just love to hear very human stories about these folks.
He was a little proper.
Yeah, he was definitely. I want you to say something about B.J. Glover, who really essentially 2 chapters talk about his influence, his really, I would argue, Black nationalism, civil rights activity, and pushing Mother Emanuel to the forefront of the movement in South Carolina, along with Reverend J. Delane and so many others. Would you share?
Remarkable figure. Benjamin J. Glover was the longest serving pastor in Emanuel's history from 1953 to 1965, so it coincided with the civil rights era, obviously, and he was simultaneously the Charleston branch president of the NAACP. So he was wearing 2 very interesting hats. His daughter wound up being one of the first to desegregate the schools in Charleston when she was literally about 6 or 7 years old at his impetus. And he was just fearless and a real agitator. He had gone away to be educated in the North and came back down to South Carolina to begin his preaching career. As soon as he got to South Carolina, tried to register to vote. And there's a wonderful story that he would tell about how he went into the registration office, and there was, of course, a literacy test in which he had to read the Constitution. He said that he could have read it in 5 languages at that point. They asked him the questions, he answered them flawlessly, and then he sees the clerk go back into a back room and get on the phone to call somebody. And the guy comes back out and says, "We just can't register you." And Glover says, well, why? Did I get something wrong? And he says, "We just can't register you." Glover leaves that meeting, obviously, without a voter's card, but with a real reputation as an agitator. And as a result, not that long afterwards, he is abducted by a group of white thugs, presumably Klansmen or something similar, taken out into the woods, beaten to within an inch of his life. The story that he tells, and it's a little bit tough to document, the story that he tells is that he only survives because there's a prostitute who is trading her wares in the woods. There was no motel in town, and she comes across him and recognizes him and runs back home telling his father, "They've killed BJ. They've killed BJ." The father comes and collects his son. They were able to get some medical care. There's a haunting picture of him in the book looking out his bedroom window while he's recuperating. And I don't know that I've ever seen anyone with emptier eyes than in that picture. He just looks haunted by what's happened. After his recovery, it's very difficult for him to even be in the same space as white people. He's suffering PTSD, essentially.
He says even light-skinned black people.
Even light-skinned black friends freak him out when they come to visit him and see how he's doing. He eventually gets past that, but needless to say, it leaves his mark. And by the time he gets to Emanuel, he is a full-fledged, hard-charging civil rights activist who spends his days in the streets, leads all kinds of marches during some very hot summers of 1962 and 63, gets arrested numerous times, including once in Columbia at a march on the Capitol, where one of his fellow marchers who was incarcerated was Jim Clyburn, the current congressman.
You share that no less figure than Clyburn is that the political movement revolved around the Glover years in the text give way. Can you all hear me? Is this a little better? Okay, thank you, Aku. Yield to the Clemente Pinckney years. And I want to ask you to share a little bit of Pinckney's vision, having been ordained as a very young boy, elected very young to the House and to the Senate in South Carolina, and how he saw his pastoral work converging with his work as an elected official in South Carolina.
Yeah. So Clemente Pinckney, as many of you will remember, was the pastor at the time of the shootings. He was the first person assassinated in the fellowship hall that night at age 41. A remarkable prodigy. He was called to preach at age 13 while walking through the sanctuary of his childhood church, little chapel in Ridgeland, South Carolina, and literally heard the voice of God calling him to preach. And at that point, took it deadly seriously. And those who knew him as a kid joke about just how, his sister uses the word weird he was, because he's wearing a suit and tie to middle school and carrying a briefcase. And he was all about business from the get-go. But he was accepted by his fellow students. He was the president of the student body. He was the president of the AME youth organization in the area, and goes on to become the youngest African American ever elected to South Carolina's General Assembly, a record that he still holds. He served several terms in the House and then was serving his 4th term in the state Senate at the time he was killed. I use him in the book as a vehicle, I guess, to talk about sort of the age of black empowerment, right? The post-civil rights era when finally obstacles to black political power had been lowered and African Americans are starting to take their rightful place in the halls of government. And it's sort of interesting to watch how he adapts to all of that. Needless to say, he's a Democrat, so he's in the minority in South Carolina. He's very committed to his district, which is both the largest and one of the poorest in the state. And he learns to work the system from the inside. He sees his work in the pulpit and his work in the well in Columbia as totally complementary. That the work of the church does not end within the church, and I think he also recognizes that the work that you do in church isn't going to provide better housing. It's not going to provide better schooling necessarily. That those goals have to be achieved elsewhere. And so he is both tending to his congregation's spiritual needs and to their political needs simultaneously.
I just want to relate to you all briefly that Reverend Pinckney was born in 1973. I was born in 1974. I had a chance to meet him at his church during an annual conference. And it was jarring to so many of us who had come into his orbit. He was possessed of an extraordinary baritone voice. He could read the phone book and you would be entranced. And it remains a great void. Yeah. I want to move briefly to what the members of Mother Emanuel call the tragedy. We were talking in the back about Miss Sanders, whose son, Tywanza, was murdered, but she also had a granddaughter with her in the church basement. And as the massacre occurred, just say more about how she protected her grandchild and about the grandchild today as a survivor.
So Felicia Sanders was a multi-generational member of the church. She and her husband were well known around town. She's a hairdresser. The two of them had raised, I think, 20 kids, only a few of them biologically their own. They had a way of taking in kids from other family members and just folks from the neighborhood that needed help. They were those types of people. She was a Bible study regular. And on that night, she brought her 11-year-old granddaughter with her. They were met by her 26-year-old son, Tywanza. And she's the shooting started when the Bible study congregants had their eyes closed in benediction. The benediction had just started. And that's when the killer opens his waist pack, takes out a Glock, and begins firing. She's the first one to realize what's going on. There was some construction work going on in the church, so at first they thought that it was maybe a circuit blowing or something like that. She instantly recognizes it as gunfire, and she yells out, "He's got a gun, everybody get down." Everybody sort of dives under the tables. She drags her 11-year-old granddaughter down with her and hugs her so tightly that she's afraid she's going to suffocate the child. She's trying to get the kid to be quiet, obviously, and instructs her to play dead. And she then has the wherewithal, somehow, to rub her leg through the pool of blood at her feet, presumably her son's, so that the killer might think that they have already been shot. She's playing possum, and it works. She survives to tell the story. She has left the church. She is no longer a member of Emanuel. I can't speak for her, obviously, but it's difficult, needless to say, for her to walk back in, as it would be for anybody. She's now a member of a Presbyterian church just around the corner, Second Presbyterian.
I hate to interrupt this conversation. It's been so rich, and I thank you both. But as John encouraged us to do, let's expand the conversation and start a time of some questions and answers. So Elder Aku Cromwell is going to help me with this. I'll be on this side of the congregation, Aku on that side. And so if anyone has questions as we continue this conversation, this is the time to ask them. And we'll need to speak up because we're getting some competition from the rainstorm. But let me just start things off by saying, Kevin, you do such an amazing job describing the tragedy, but then also the days that followed when, as you said earlier, so many of the congregants who had suffered the loss of loved ones were moved to publicly forgive the killer. Say more about that.
Well, that's really the animating theme behind this book. As I mentioned before, what really set me off on this quest was trying to figure out how in the world those people had gotten up and expressed forgiveness towards this guy. As I interviewed those who had spoken that day, as well as any number of theologians and other members of the church and of the AME hierarchy, I started to feel that those of us who may have perceived that the forgiveness expressed that day toward Dylan Roof, that it was for Dylan Roof, I think probably misunderstood the intent and maybe misunderstood the role that forgiveness and grace have played over time in the Black church and in the AME denomination in particular. When you talk to those folks, they will tell you, first of all, they have no idea how the words came out of their mouth. Totally unpremeditated, unplanned. In fact, they didn't even know they were going to be given an opportunity to speak that day. And they can only describe it as something mystical, God talking. The words came out of their mouth, but they were merely the vessel. And they'll tell you to this day that they can't really understand it in any other way as being a movement of God, because as Chris Singleton, the son of one of the victims, told me, you know, there's no other way I could understand forgiving a man who had just walked into church and killed my mother with her eyes closed because she was Black. It could only be God, and he still sticks to that position. My view started to evolve as I learned more, to feel that what was really happening there was it was a form of release, of relief. It was a way to, as Felicia Sanders tells me, to get out of bed morning after morning and put one foot in front of the other, given what they had gone through. And when I expand that across the whole history of the church, I concluded that forgiveness has, over time, served that role for African American Christians who have had to face one, oppressive set of circumstances after the next over a 400-year span in this country. And so I started to conclude that it was its own form of resistance, really, and a way to reclaim agency by people who had been robbed of it by their victimizer. The one thing that cannot be taken away from them is their ability to forgive. And one of the folks I interviewed, Anthony Thompson, who was one of the gentlemen that spoke at the bond hearing that day and offered forgiveness. His wife was the leader of the Bible study that night. The way he put it to me was that forgiving had, for him, forgiving meant that he did not have to make a lifetime partner of this guy. That made a lot of sense to me. Yeah. And so I really think that that's what was going on here.
This is just a comment. It reminded me a little bit of, remember when the shooter shot the children at the Amish school? And that was a part of their religion, that they were forgiven. How much is forgiveness a part of the AME church? Because some things are really hard to forgive.
Yeah, and there should be no confusion that those who forgave did not speak for everybody in this community or in the church or in their families. There were families that were deeply divided over the decision by some members to forgive. I quote several people in the book about sort of their struggle with this whole choice, and they describe it as a path that they're traveling at different rates of speed, right? Which needs to be allowed, and we need to recognize that it is a very difficult journey, and that everyone won't reach the same endpoint.
I think one of the potential challenges with the language, and I think Kevin does as good a job as he talks about how Bonhoeffer sees forgiveness, how James Cone talked about forgiveness, amongst other theologians and philosophers, that there is, and Kevin quotes me, and I think this is one way to think about it, there is a trope in literature and in film, the magical Negro. Are you all familiar with this concept? And the concept is that a black character shows up. They have no real agency, no real sexuality, no real life, but they appear like in the Legend of Bagger Vance or in the Green Mile to assist white people in their moral discovery. So essentially, they have no other purpose other than to school white people morally, which means their humanity in and of itself has no value except in its teaching function for white people coming to whatever ethical discovery. The challenge I have is we expect black communities to do what white communities will not do. In nonviolence, in forgiveness, there is often an excuse, or we have to be careful that some type of super morality emerges and we say, wow, look at them, instead of demanding of each and every one of us justice, forgiveness. And my understanding of forgiveness is the Hebrew and Afro-Asiatic understanding is that you cannot forgive one who does not seek forgiveness. Without that person seeking forgiveness and seeking restoration, seeking repentance, seeking reparation, then you cannot have forgiveness. My argument is that there is no culture of repentance or reparation within the American historical, economic, and political tradition that holds. I was born in 1974. Everybody in my family prior to me was born in sanctioned American apartheid. my mother and my father, I knew people who knew enslaved people. This is not thousands of years ago, thousands of generations ago. And even now, there is a political regime to undo what was done. And so I do not see that trajectory in our faith tradition, our political tradition, our economic tradition. And the question is tomorrow. Tomorrow.
Yeah, I argue in the book that this certainly isn't the case for all white people, but that there were certainly certain white people across the country and in Charleston who hoped that those forgivers, if I can use that term, were speaking for all of Black America, that we were absolved in some way, and that we wouldn't have to take account for the legacy of white supremacy that's been created in this country and that led to the poison that afflicted this 21-year-old kid. And I think within Charleston, there's been a lot of debate about this. You know, the town became known, the church certainly became known for this forgiveness narrative. But there's certainly also a feeling that that narrative let white people off the hook, that it made it too easy for us. And you know, there were some important symbolic changes that took place in the city in the aftermath. The flag came down in Columbia. The statue of John C. Calhoun came down from Marion Square. But you know, whether or not there's any real attack on the inequities we know are still out there, you know, I think it'll be the 50th or 100th anniversary maybe before we can really assess that. Yes, sir.
Well, I agree that, well, I'm still pondering the issue of forgiveness and whether it's binary and transactional. But in 2024, in the presidential primaries, Nikki Haley from South Carolina made the infamous statement that America is not a racist country. That is, from a white perspective, or just as a human perspective, I saw that as pouring salt into the wound or tearing the scab off of a wound, whatever the metaphor is. Especially for the people of Charleston, especially for the African American community in Charleston, and for the members of Emanuel Church. And so I would like I'm sure that this came up in your investigating and writing of the book, but also just would welcome any comments regarding that, because it seemed to me like a get-out-of-jail-free card for white America.
Right. I mean, I don't think anybody can read these 360-odd pages and not conclude that there has not been systemic institutionalized racism in this country. I mean, that's really what the book does, is document that through the vehicle of this one church, you know, all under one roof, essentially. So, yeah, you know, seems like an easy assertion to combat. Shocking for her to make the statement, given what she lived through and the role that she played in 2015. She was instrumental to bringing the flag down. You know, she had watched it stay up since 1961 or 2 as a direct affront to 25% of the population of the state. So rings empty to me.
I actually have a question, if I may. You spoke in Charleston at Emanuel with Dr. Thomas, the editor of the Christian Recorder, and I cannot remember whether it was there or in your book, but you referred to the 21-year-old who was poisoned. Can you speak any to, I know that you had limited exchanges with him in writing, but can you speak any to his mindset or the culture that was perpetuating his act of violence that he committed?
So people ask me, what was the family like? Did he absorb this at home? And my sense is that, yes, there was probably some run-of-the-mill, sort of characteristic white Southern racism in that household. But the way I put it in the book is, I don't think it was an organizing principle in this family. I don't think it was what they were about every day. And I tend to take him at his word, as he gave it in his interviews with the FBI, that it really was just the internet. And that's where this devolution happened for him. He was a high school dropout, very antisocial, wound up holding himself up in his room really for years at a time and just stayed online. He says that this all started to happen when Trayvon Martin took place, and he goes online and he Googles black on white crime. And he happens upon one of these white supremacist websites, and he just literally gets sucked down this rabbit hole and never emerges. I did not interview him in person. I did exchange a couple of letters with him while he was on death row, as he remains in Terre Haute, Indiana, in a federal penitentiary. In those letters, he remained totally remorseless, defended his actions, and I had some very specific questions for him about the way things went down. This was the whole point of my writing to him. I wasn't looking for a pen pal. I had some very detailed questions about choices he had made and the timing of various events. And the main one was that on any normal Wednesday night, he would not have arrived in time for the Bible study. The Bible study typically started at 6, ended at 7. Everybody went home. Maybe the sexton was still cleaning up. He had staked out the church any number of times in advance, and in one of those trips had stopped and asked somebody, when does Bible study start, and had been told 6 o'clock. Nonetheless, he doesn't leave Columbia or near Columbia where he lives, Lexington County, South Carolina, until after 6 o'clock for what's a 2-hour drive to Charleston. So he shows up after 8. On any normal day, no one would have been there. But on this day, there was what's called a quarterly conference. The AMEs in the audience know what this is. Every 3 months, the presiding elder, who's sort of a bureaucratic middleman in the AME hierarchy. Excuse me if there are any. Is there a presiding elder that I've insulted in the audience? The presiding elder comes and oversees a business meeting, and there is a method, as per the name of the denomination, to these meetings. Questions are asked: how many baptisms, how many marriages, how many deaths, how many new members, how much money raised, et cetera, et cetera. This meeting went on for over an hour, and so by the time it broke up, and Ruth arrives in the church, it actually is this sort of perfect soft target. But he had no way of knowing that there would be anybody there when he got there. Anyway, getting to my point, sort of long story long, I asked him in the letter about this. How is it that this could have possibly taken place? Why did he leave when he did? And he says, well, there's always divine intervention. Not that I believe in it, he says. So I tell that long story to give a sense for his mindset. Now these letters were exchanged 4 or 5 years ago, so I can't speak to where he is now. The other interaction I had with him, if you want to call it that, is remarkably, I was able to file a Freedom of Information Act request for non-privileged telephonic communications between him and family members while he was incarcerated in Charleston. And darn if, a couple of weeks later I don't get back a thumb drive with 45 15-minute long phone calls between him and his mother and his grandparents that I was able to listen to. They know that these calls are being recorded, so they were smart enough not to talk explicitly about the facts of the case. But what does come across is how terribly detached he is, and how unappreciative he is, not only of his own situation, but of the harm that he's caused his family. I mean, obviously, they haven't been damaged in the same way that his victims and their families have, but he's ruined their lives too, and destroyed this family. I mean, they're just bereft and they can't understand any of it. And he just sort of plays with them. It seems like any time he can say something to sort of agitate them, he does. And there's no sense on his part of what he's put them through. And there's a very telling exchange in which he's talking to his grandfather, and he instructs the grandfather, you know, if the cops or the lawyers or prosecutors come around to talk to you guys, don't talk to them. And the grandfather says, well, Dylan, you know, I got to tell you, that's all that me and your grandmother do. We're just this constant one guy after the next coming to the door. And he says, Dylan, I know I don't need to fuss at you. You don't need to be fussed at. He kind of cradles him like a damaged bird. But for your grandmama and me, this has just been pure hell. And there's a pause, and Dylan says, seriously? And the grandfather says, yeah, seriously. You know. So it was, very hard to understand in depth how he got to where he was. The trial itself was very unsatisfying on this score, because he took his defense away from his defense lawyers for the second half of the trial, in which they're determining whether he gets the death penalty or not, specifically because he knew that the defense lawyers wanted to introduce evidence about his psychiatric instability. And it mattered more than anything to him. It mattered more to him than his own survival, that people understand that what he had done was absolutely intentional. He wanted to be seen as a zealot, not as a lunatic.
I'm going to make two assumptions. I assume, Kevin, your connection with the AME is probably at 10 years, right, of a deep connection. I assume yours goes a little longer than that. Okay, so what have you both seen in these 10 years shift in the culture or the DNA of the denomination?
You're so much better at that than I could possibly be.
Not enough. Not enough. I could say more, and I have their colleagues here, clergy colleagues, and their faithful lay folk here.
Well, I've been struck as I learned about the denomination by a couple of things, and I don't know that it necessarily indicates change over the last 10 years, but I do think it's interesting. One is just how socially conservative the denomination is, and where we see it these days is in the debate over same-sex marriage, which is prohibited within the AME Church on threat of defrocking. And I asked the question around Emanuel over the years. Nobody could identify a single member of the church who was an out LGBTQ person. And the pastor there has never performed a same-sex marriage and never will. At least the current pastor never will. So that really interests me. The other thing that I found myself sort of captivated by in studying the denomination was just the absolute power and authority of the bishops. Their power is immense. They can appoint and remove pastors at will. And in a situation like Emanuel, it hasn't always worked in the church's favor, because a pastor comes in without any base of support within the congregation, and it can take years for them to develop that base of support, if ever. So, very different system than this church.
I will say that Metropolitan does not agree with the denomination. I do not agree with the denomination. We are radically hospitable and inclusive. I will say it to you, and I will say it to them. I have said it to them, that God's children are God's children. And where we do not include God's children at the table, we commit the same desecrating sacrilege that led to the need to separate from white Methodists. It is, I think, odious to God. What I would also say is, unfortunately, like many institutions in the United States, institutional self-preservation trumps the founding spirit and ethos. Now, the nuance is when you have been around as long as I have, and you have loving, supportive people as I do, who forgive your manifold sins and wickedness and try to keep things moving, you can have some insulation, but we do not agree and find where the church stands there to be hateful and wrong.
The evidence that Pastor Lamar is the exception is as recent as the last general conference of the denomination last year in Ohio, where there was a resolution proposed that would allow pastors basically individual choice about whether to conduct same-sex marriages, and it was rejected virtually without debate.
So,
Sure. So I would like to know what you would like us to take away from your book. I think one of the stories that you shared tonight that was most moving was the historic deconstruction of the church, physically, plank by plank, and then rebuilding that. So taking that as a sort of parable, spiritually or emotionally, politically, socially, does your book aim to deconstruct or to construct something new?
Well, I think the book aims to explain the cycles of suppression and resistance that we see across the arc of African American history. And we see it from the very early moments of this church's history all the way through current day. I hope that what you take away is a story of persistence and resilience and strength. It's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but nonetheless of a people who are committed to their faith, and in this case have really been tested, and as they would say, still we rise, that they continue to endure and persist and do it through faith. And that to me has been the most inspiring part of the story.
I appreciate the entirety of the book, your great history in there, but actually as a bit of a takeaway in answer to her question, and also in part in answer to Reverend John Molina Moore's question, I would actually, I guess I'm a bit of a ringer, if you will, in the room. My wife was raised in the Presbyterian Church. I became involved in the Presbyterian Church, but I am also a lifelong AME. So I am representing both sides in this. My job, even though I just live around the corner from this church, my job is I am the director of global security for the AME Church, and my position was established in 2021, in part in response to the Emanuel 9, which was 6 years prior, incredibly. But part of the answer is it's very difficult to change the culture when you are people of faith and you have that extensive forgiveness, it is very difficult to encourage people to prepare. And then Metropolitan AME is an outstanding example of preparedness. They have a small police force, almost, if you will, to rival some small towns with the numbers who are on hand. The history and the resources of Metropolitan are different. On the other side of that, the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church, is very very progressive. Some of the locations within this, the National Capital Presbytery, have flags out in order to show the support, in order to show Black Lives Matter or the LGBTQ support. And that also makes you a target. So I have worked on both sides of the equation in order to help protect the churches. And I do know that we have a long way to go in order to continue protecting. The AME Church also, in part, in answer to that question, the AME Church is in 41 countries with more than 7,300 churches. And there are very different political philosophies, and even sometimes your lives are at risk if you are out as an LGBTQ member. So it's very difficult. It's not very easy to delineate those lines. And these issues are still being discussed, as you said, in the last General Conference and at the Global Development Council meetings, which deal with districts 14 through 20. But all of this is to say we are working at it. I am actively working at it on both the PCUSA side and the AME side in order to ensure that we are all staying safe.
Thank you, Aku. I think we have time for one more question, and then... Okay, yes.
Before the final question, I just want to make sure that we all join in thanking Kevin for this extraordinary book, for his amazing work. If you do not have the book, please buy the book. It is riveting and it lives with you. So thank you again, Kevin.
Okay.
First of all, it's an honor to be here and hear this discussion. I'm curious what you learned about the response of the Charleston community to the tragedy, and how has that response either endured or fallen away in the past 10 years?
Yeah. Well, you may remember that on the Saturday after the Wednesday night shootings, actually it may have been the Sunday, I'm trying to remember now, but anyway, that weekend, there was a unity march across the Ravenel Bridge, which is this 2.5-mile span across the Cooper River. People of all races, all generations came out, joined hands across the bridge. And it was this really moving representation of the community's support for the families, for the church, for the community. And I do think that that's extended over the last decade to a certain extent. I think that in Charleston, as in New York after 9/11, there's sort of a Charleston before 6/17 and a Charleston after 6/17. I've only lived there about 2.5 years, so I'm not a great judge. I'm probably not qualified, but it feels to me that it's a softer place, a more self-reflective place, particularly as it pertains to race. There have been these, I think, important symbolic measures taken, and there have also been a lot of quiet conversations that I think take place that didn't take place before. A good example is Dean and I, when we were in Charleston in 2019 for 6 or 7 months doing research, would go to a joint book study about race that was held at Grace Cathedral, which is an Episcopalian church, in conjunction with its neighboring church, Mount Zion AME. So you had a white congregation and a black congregation coming together to discuss books on race. That didn't happen before, and it grew directly out of this incident. There's a bookstore on King Street in Charleston, Buxton Books, which has been hugely supportive of this book. It was created specifically by the owners to be a place where conversations like the one we're having tonight could take place surrounding books about race and human relations. So I do think that the community still very much feels what happened in 2015. You can ask almost anybody in Charleston where they were that night, and they'll be able to tell you. It's like the day that Kennedy was shot, or the day that King was shot. People remember where they were and what they were doing, and many of them knew at least one victim. It's a small enough town and sort of a compact and closely knit enough town that if you didn't have your hair done by Felicia Sanders, you probably ran into Cynthia Hurd at the library at some point. So people knew the victims and the survivors.
I wanted to ask, did the shooter know the significance, the historical significance of Emanuel, and would you tell those who don't know why it's referred to as Mother Emanuel?
Those are great questions. Thank you for that. It's hard to know exactly how much he knew, and this is one of the specific questions that I asked him in my exchange of letters because I was curious about that. In his interview with the FBI on the day of his arrest, which was the day after the shootings, he explained that he knew that AME stood for African Methodist Episcopal, he thought. Wasn't completely sure, but he thought. He knew that it was a historic black church. There was a notebook, a notepad that he had scribbled notes on, including the names of a number of churches that were potential targets, and before he chose Emanuel. And on that sheet is the name Vesey, V-E-S-S-E-Y. He's misspelled Denmark Vesey, but it leads to the conclusion that at some point he's read something about the church and its historical role. He also told a friend of his on a sort of during a drunken bender a few nights before the shootings that he was going to shoot up a church that had where Martin Luther King had preached. So he had done some research, but I don't necessarily think that his understanding went much deeper than that. I do think that at some level he had to have had a visceral understanding of the meaning of the black church and its import. There was a reason he picked a church as a target. He described it once as, can't remember the exact word, but it's essentially, the most outrageous racist attack that you could conceive of would be to go in a black church and shoot it up. And so that's why he did that. Now, I'm sorry, the last part of your question was?
Mother Emanuel.
Oh, Mother Emanuel, yes. So it was the first AME church south of here, south of Baltimore, when it was created in 1865, and it seeded other churches, first within Charleston, and then beyond Charleston, around South Carolina. South Carolina was then and remains now the densest population of African Methodist Episcopal members anywhere in the country, largely because of the story I told before of that the church had been rooted there even before the Civil War, and they were able to use that foundation to build on after the Civil War. But it is called Mother Emanuel because, like Mother Bethel in Philadelphia, it is considered the church that gave birth to the faith in the southern United States.
Well, that testimony to Mother Emanuel is a great note on which to end. Hate to conclude this conversation, but I hope it will continue in many of our communities going forward. Before we transition to the signings, we do have from the publisher a free book giveaway. So one of you who is registered for this tonight might get selected for a free copy. So, Pastor, you preach grace, right? This is pure grace.
Hakan Atasiver.
It's worth every penny, Hakan. Worth every penny. It's worth every penny.
So from the American Turkish Friendship Association, great friends and partners here in the city of Fairfax. So this does conclude our formal program. Again, pick up a copy of the book if you haven't gotten one already. Kevin will be signing and inscribing books. And I just want to thank you, Bill, so much, and you, Kevin, for an amazing evening.
And thank you. Thank you. If you guys will just give me a point of personal privilege for 1 second, I also want to thank my new and dear friend, Pastor Lamar. Thank you so much for the time it took. I don't take it for granted. I know it's a chore, but really appreciate the conversation, and I hope we stay in touch. And Pastor Brenton, this has just been fantastic. Your organizational abilities, putting this thing together, just couldn't have been any better, and I appreciate your friendship. You know, Henry, after spending all this time around African Methodists, when you invited me to start hanging out with Presbyterians, I almost felt like it was, what's the right word? Predestined, I would say.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I'll say again, a point of personal privilege, Kevin and I went to college together. I used to read his stories in the Duke University school newspaper, The Chronicle. And Kevin, you've come a long way. Yeah. Not surprised at all. No. Multiple Pulitzer Prizes, and what a magnificent accomplishment this book is. So,
Thank
Kevin,
you all
thanks
for
being
coming. I
here.
really appreciate it.